Peace on hold. After 3 years of talks, Colombia delays its deal with the FARC. We have a special report from Bogota. Also on today's program, justice 20 years in the making. Former Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic is found guilty of genocide. And in picture this, the multi-million-dollar non-event. New Zealand decides to stick with the status quo. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Plans to end Latin America's last civil war have once again been put on hold. As the clock struck midnight on Wednesday, the long-awaited deadline for the Colombian government and the FARC rebels to reach a deal was missed. Differences between the two sides were blamed, but they both say they will keep trying to end the decades-long conflict. Since it began more than 50 years ago, 220,000 people have been killed and millions more displaced. It has hindered Colombia's economy and brought untold misery to its people. Today's newsmakers are these two, Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos and FARC rebel leader Rodrigo Londoño, as we ask if they can work around their differences and finally bring peace to Colombia.
The scars of war run deep in Colombia, a country that's battled a guerrilla insurgency for more than half a century. The government is closer than ever to signing a truce with its old enemy, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC. But a deadline to sign a deal in Cuba has come and gone. Decades of fighting have left more than 220,000 people dead and displaced 6 million others. I'm on a journey to find out if the country can finally forgive and move on from its past, and if lasting peace is still possible in Colombia. The Rio Magdalena runs across Colombia's vast jungle. Juan Esteban remembers a time when the bodies of victims were a regular sight here.
First we saw them whole, then they began appearing in pieces. They said that they were fighting for territory. The guerrillas wanted the whole region, and the paramilitaries fought back.
And how many bodies would you see a day?
Normal, 3 or 4, every day.
The FARC led a Marxist rebellion against the Colombian state in the 1960s. Its forces soon took control of nearly a third of the country, financing their struggle by kidnapping, extortion, and the cocaine trade. In the 1990s, a US-funded military campaign called Plan Colombia decimated the group's ranks. The FARC is now only 7,000 fighters strong, and for the last 4 years has been in talks to stop the fighting. Supporters of the process say it's now or never.
The FARC has reached an agreement in almost all the items of the agenda. Well, I have no doubt about the political willingness of the FARC to lay down their weapons and to demobilize. We won't get a better deal.
But there's still a long way to go. Both sides haven't agreed how and when FARC forces will disarm and come out of the forests. And Colombians fear other armed militias and criminal groups are already stepping into former FARC territory.
It's not just the FARC, there's the ELN, and they're not in the peace process. So even if we get rid of the FARC, the ELN remains. And where does that leave us?
Everywhere you go, Colombians have a story to tell about how this conflict has touched them. Blanca Nubia Diaz lost her husband and her 15-year-old daughter.
They killed her in the Pozo La Cantera. She was raped, tortured, and went missing. Over there in Havana, they're talking peace with the guerrillas. But what about the paramilitaries? Me, as a mother, seeing what they did to my daughter, I would never forgive those people.
This used to be one of the most dangerous roads in Colombia.
The FARC are also notorious kidnappers. One of their most lucrative schemes is known as the pesca milagrosa, or miraculous catch. They would come down from the mountains, block the roads, and try to snatch a valuable hostage.
The truck drivers who worked this route say they risked their lives every time they got behind the wheel. These days, they're in higher spirits. Security is much improved. But many still feel their president is playing a dangerous game with the guerrillas. There's still uncertainty over how people will vote when and if the peace deal with the FARC is signed and put to a referendum. But one thing is certain: the road to peace will be long and difficult. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers, Bogota.
Well, joining me now to discuss if Colombia can reach a lasting peace is Peter Hakem. He is President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue and joins me from Washington, D.C. And in Medellin, Colombia, is Adrian Elseme. He's the Editor-in-Chief of Colombia Reports. Thank you, both of you, for joining us. Let's start with you, Peter Hakem. Is the delay a suggestion that the government and the FARC are not quite ready for peace?
Well, I think they're both ready for peace. The question is, there's lots of details to work out before they can reach a deal. And these are important details. They involve questions of justice, punishment, safety, and they'll straggle on for a little bit longer, I think, but one has to be encouraged by the result of the meeting with John Kerry yesterday in Havana, when the FARC said that they themselves are ready to sign a peace agreement. And it's now down to details, and as you suggested, a referendum. But I think it's going to happen. It's been going on, the negotiations. I think both sides are ready to make peace. Like I say, it's working out the final shreds of this.
Adrian Elseme, was it political genius from President Santos to put the decision in the people's hands, even if a deal is struck?
Yeah, he did promise that, although there is still much debate about how this must be put before a popular vote. The FARC wants a constituent assembly, which potentially could change the entire constitution, while the government wants to hold a plebiscite, which requires much less people to turn out and is less risky for, well, major changes in the law.
Mr. Elseme, what do you worry about? What do you think is the biggest sticking point that's stopping a deal right now?
Well, at the moment, it seems to be a situation rather similar to that in Northern Ireland in the 1990s, where the mistrust between both parties kind of impedes the demobilization. So the FARC would want to demobilize after a peace deal, and the government wants the FARC to demobilize before signing a peace deal. And that's kind of where both parties are debating on now.
Peter Hakem, do you think that with all the atrocities over the years from the FARC and, of course, the right-wing paramilitaries as well, that there's so many people who have been affected by this violence over the years? Everybody seems to have a family member who was probably killed or hurt in this conflict. Do you think that helps feed into this fundamental distrust that still permeates throughout?
This, of course, this has been a very cruel, prolonged, vicious insurgency. The response from the Colombian government over the years and groups associated with the military, the paramilitaries. There's no question that there's a huge animosity that has been built up over the years, And in some ways, that's why some kind of going to the people, some kind of referendum or plebiscite is probably a good idea, that give the people a chance to say whether they think the peace agreement is right. Because if there is long-term disagreement with this, the implementation will become very, very difficult.
Adrian, with so many millions of people affected, so many millions losing loved ones on the FARC side and the paramilitaries, or at the hands of the FARC and at the hands of the paramilitaries, will some people have to accept that they won't get true justice in order to get lasting peace in Colombia?
That's the sad reality. And this is what is the difficult selling point in the talks, because for any conflict to end, like, there needs to be sacrifices to justice, and they will always hurt most where the victims are. So Colombia will have to accept that it's not going to have the justice it feels it deserves.
Adrian, former President Alvaro Uribe has said, quote, "The rebels are getting away with murder." Is that sour grapes from him, or does he have a point?
Clearly, the rebels are going to get away with murder, well, with thousands, tens of thousands of murders. But so is the government, which the former president tends to forget. The state is currently implicated in more than 24,000 crimes related to the war. So the judicial pressure is heaviest on the state. And that's kind of what the opposition to the peace talks tends to forget. That the guilt for all the bloodshed is mutual. And you can't have a partial justice where, like a sort of Nuremberg trial, where only the FARC goes to trial and the government gets away with murder.
Yeah. Peter, there's a changing Venezuela, there's a changing Cuba, and a thaw with the United States. I wonder just how much do those two situations affect the reality on the ground in Colombia and affect the reality and the prospects for lasting peace?
You know, I don't think they affected a whole lot. Maybe Adrian will disagree with me, but I think the peace process in Colombia is really a national process. It's taking place in Cuba, obviously. That's the only place where the FARC guerrillas felt they could be comfortable, at least within Latin America. And but I don't think developments in Venezuela, they'll have some impact on Colombia economically. They may create some refugees, but I don't think they're going to have much of an impact on the peace process itself.
Okay, let me put that to Adrian finally. The geopolitics of it all, the United States and Cuba making friends again, and the situation in Venezuela, does that mean that this is good for the lasting prospects for peace in the country?
Well, I would consider Venezuela a liability because the situation is extremely unstable. And both countries have always been very, very close and have shared problems, especially in the border region. In regards to Cuba, I think in geopolitical sense, you're really looking at a changing atmosphere in the entire continent. But I would see this more as coincidental than really tightly related.
Okay, we'll have to wait and see if a deal can be reached, and of course, if that gets put into the hands of the people, if it is reached, we'll all be watching Colombia closely. Peter Hakem and Adrian Elsema, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, 20 years on, justice is dealt to Radovan Karadzic as he's found guilty of genocide. And in Picture This, out with the new, we're sticking with the old. New Zealand keeps its flag. The most senior Serbian political figure to face justice for war crimes in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, Radovan Karadzic, has been found guilty of genocide by UN judges in The Hague. The 70-year-old, who maintained his innocence throughout the trial, faced 11 separate charges, including extermination, crimes against humanity, and 2 counts of genocide. He was found guilty of all but 1 count of genocide. The Newsmakers' Soraya Leni is in Sarajevo and sent us this report.
If they want to fight to the end, then it's going to be fight to the end of the Muslim army.
We do not accept a Bosnian state. We want our own state.
We want the international community to stop supporting Muslim side because this is the way to prolong this war.
He was president of the self-declared Republika Srpska and supreme commander of its armed forces. From 1992 through to 1995, Radovan Karadzic led the charge to carve out a so-called Greater Serbia. His forces were given the mandate to kill or expel all non-Serbs.
Don't think you won't take Bosnia to hell, and Muslim people perhaps to extinction.
100,000 people were killed and 2 million others displaced. The UN's International Criminal Tribunal charged him for war crimes, and one of the most feared men in Europe became its most wanted. In 1996, Karadzic left Sarajevo and disappeared. The nation tried to recover, but at every corner, the scars of war remain, especially here in the mountains of Srebrenica, where thousands of mothers lost their sons.
They used to play football in the garden when they were kids. Me and my husband used to sit and support the winner. Those were my happiest days, and I can't forget them.
That atrocity began here. In July of 1995, this was actually a UN safe zone. Thousands of Bosnian Muslims came here seeking protection. Instead, Bosnian Serb forces overran the UN. They separated the men from the women, and they took the men away in trucks and killed them.
They murdered 8,372 men and boys in little more than 3 days. Only a handful survived.
Right before I jumped off the truck, I heard people screaming, gunshots, and it was obvious that was the end. I was hiding in the truck and afraid to get out. Everyone wanted to live a bit longer.
Survivors lived with their ghosts for the next decade, and Karadzic became a name in history. But Europe's most wanted man had been living in plain sight, in the Serbian capital as new-aged healer Dragan Dabic. Karadzic is the highest-ranking Bosnian Serb official to face trial at The Hague. He has held firm that he was only trying to protect his people, but prosecutors say all roads lead to him. It's taken 21 years for Karadzic to face a verdict. For mothers and wives of Srebrenica victims, like Meira, the idea of justice is hollow.
They can try him as much as they want, but he already sentenced our kids to death. There's a sea of white tombstones out there. Each of them represents a single person. No matter what the verdict is, it means nothing to us.
And that legacy is what Karadzic left here, in a divided land that struggles to forgive. Soraya Leni for the Newsmakers, Potocari, Srebrenica.
Radovan Karadzic has been sentenced to 40 years in prison after being found guilty of genocide. And now joining me to analyze the verdict is Adnan Haskic. He's a political analyst and co-authored The Foreign Policies of Post-Yugoslav States. He joins from Sarajevo. Thank you very much for joining, Adnan. 40 years for Radovan Karadzic. Do you believe that justice has been served?
Well, that's a question we've been asking ourselves, and I guess the whole public in Bosnia has been asking itself whether this is really serving the justice, whether this means that the justice has been served. And of course, there are different opinions when it comes to this. On the one hand side, you have people or political representatives of from Republika Srpska who were quick in saying that this verdict should not in any way be used as a pretext for the constitutional change, i.e. the abolition of Republika Srpska. On the other side, the first reactions from the Bosniaks, especially the victims' organizations, is that this is a disgrace, and I quote this, that they expected the sentence to be much harsher. I think that the expectations are actually set quite high, and there are limits to what the international justice system can offer. We have to appreciate the fact that the Bosnian conflict at least will end in a kind of a closure, which is going to be served by the International Crime Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. And I think there is a value in this. I don't think that any other conflict, take for example Syria right now, will have the benefit of an international court to adjudicate all the horrible things that were committed there. So I think that the expectations, of course, are nothing unexpected. On the one hand side, it was too harsh. On the other side, it was considered to be not harsh enough. But I guess this is just the reality of the acceptance of the verdicts of the International Crime Tribunal.
So as you say that, on the one hand, there are those who believe that it was too harsh, and on the other hand, there are those who believe it was a disgrace and not harsh enough. In a divided society, after the Dayton Agreement, you've got the Republika Srpska, the Serb autonomous region. Do you fear that this might trigger nationalist sentiment and further divisions within Bosnia-Herzegovina?
Well, unfortunately, when we discuss the effects of the International Crime Tribunal on what we call the societal peace in Bosnia, the record is not excellent. I've got to say this. So far, it has always been about rejection on the one hand side or endorsement, but basically the narratives have mainly remained the same. What seems to lack in this equation is definitely the further democratization of the country, really dealing with the events that happened more than 2 decades ago in this area. And I think that what court actually does, and this is perhaps the biggest value in all this, is that it collects the evidence, it creates a particular narrative. And these factual things will once have to be approached realistically by all of us when we discuss our past, and then maybe be used as a fundament for building a better future.
Now, Adnan, Karadzic was found not guilty for genocide in those other municipalities or towns. Do you think that the judge made a sound decision there?
Well, I believe that it was perhaps, as I said, I think the expectations were raised too high. Basically, the verdict, which mentions the genocide, was once again underlined or reiterated in case of Srebrenica. There was some expectation. There were some people who expected that this particular definition could then be extended to other municipalities. However, this was not the case. I think that we need to respect the decision of the court. I think that this is essential, especially now in this political atmosphere that we're having. Nonetheless, the gravity of the crime and all the atrocities that have happened has been proven. Radovan Karadzic was found guilty of all the other charges except for that one, which I think is sufficient enough. And I think this actually is something that we should try to build upon.
Adnan Haskic, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much. In today's picture this, it was a close call, but New Zealand has finally decided on the flag debate that has gripped the nation for months. And it looks likely that they've decided to stick with what they started with. Let's take a look at New Zealand's Great Flag Saga.
A little bit disappointed that the flag didn't change tonight. We gave them that chance to do that. You know, they've spoken in big numbers and, you know, they've made a call.
Today's newsmakers have been these two men, Colombia's President Juan Manuel Santos and FARC rebel leader Rodrigo Londoño. In their hands lies the future of peace and stability in Colombia. After marathon peace talks, they've missed a long-awaited deadline to end the country's war with the FARC rebels. Unable to set aside their differences, this time the talks will now continue as both sides say they hope to reach a deal by the end of the year. And while the majority of Colombians want to finally see peace, some worry the deal could usher in yet new challenges for the country. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.